No one at the preserve believed this baby elephant would survive. He was born too early, too small, and far too weak for a world built for giants. The veterinarians shook their heads. The rules of nature were repeated. Even his own mother turned away. But in the moment when everyone accepted the end, one elderly zookeeper, who had spent his entire life refusing to interfere with nature, made a decision no one expected. That choice didn't just change the fate of a fragile life. It forced everyone to confront a deeper question. Is following the rules always the same as doing what's right? Dawn slid over the Red Rock ridges outside Red Rock Wildlife Preserve, turning the sand a calm copper. Thomas Walker made his rounds the way he always had, keys tapping his thigh, breath steady in the cold. 40 years with elephants had taught him the same lesson every morning. Quiet wasn't safety. It was a pause before something changed, and he could feel it in his bones. He stopped at the maternity barn when he heard the low, strained rumble. Too deep, too urgent to ignore. Inside, the air smelled of hay and antiseptic, and the heaters fought a desert night that never fully let go. Marisol, the cow, swayed on tired legs, her belly tight with early labor that shouldn't have started for weeks. The boards under Thomas's boots creaked like they were bracing too. Dr. Elaine Brooks stood near the gate, sleeves rolled, eyes sharp behind fogged glasses. 5 weeks early, she said, voice clipped to keep fear from spreading. Thomas answered with a nod, but his stomach sank anyway. Premature calves were a gamble, and the preserve's equipment was built for normal births, not for desperate ones. The barn lights flickered once, then held. The first push brought only silence, and the wet slap of fluid against straw. Thomas watched Marisol's trunk curl toward the ground, as if she already sensed the odds. A young intern, Mateo Ruiz, hovered by the supply cart, knuckles white on the handle. He kept looking to Thomas for permission to hope, and Thomas didn't know what to give him. Not in front of a dying calf. When the calf finally slid into the world, it didn't look like a miracle. It looked unfinished. Too small. Too slick. The skin wrinkled like it hadn't decided to belong. The chest fluttered instead of rising, and the sound it made was more breath than cry. Thomas had seen newborn elephants wobble to their feet. This one barely remembered to inhale, to claim the air. Elaine moved fast. Towel, suction, stethoscope pressed to a ribcage hardly bigger than her hands. "Heart's there," she muttered, then quieter. "But it's weak." Thomas crouched just outside Marisol's reach, counting the calf's breaths like numbers could become a shield. Mateo whispered, "Come on, little guy," as if volume alone could keep death back. Marisol tried to stand, sank again, then fought up with a groan that filled the barn. She reached her trunk, toward the calf, touched the slick forehead, and pulled back as if the cold shocked her. Thomas had watched mothers lift calves with one confident nudge. This time the trunk hesitated, uncertain, and drifted toward Marisol's own body, toward warmth, toward survival. "Can we help him, nurse?" Mateo asked, voice cracking on the word help. Elaine stared at the monitor, temperature falling, oxygen dipping, a line that refused to steady. "If he can't regulate heat," she said, "feeding won't matter." The words weren't cruel. They were the kind of truth people learned to speak when they couldn't bear to cry anymore. Mateo's eyes stayed on the calf. Thomas felt the old rule tighten around his ribs. Don't force what the body can't carry. He'd taught it to trainees 100 times, sometimes gently, sometimes like an order. Yet watching that calf shiver, he tasted metal in his mouth. He remembered storms, droughts, stampedes, nature taking what it wanted with no apology, and he hated how familiar it felt. They tried anyway, warming blankets, a heat lamp, rubbing the calf's side until the skin pinked up and then faded again. Elaine checked the thermometer and swore under her breath. "He's dropping," she warned, and the barn went still except for Marisol's breathing and the thin alarm that ticked like impatience. Even the dust seemed to hold its breath. Then Marisol stood at last and stepped away from the calf. Not far, just enough. Enough to choose herself. Enough to obey the instinct that said, invest in what survives. Her eyes stayed on him, dark and unreadable, but her body angled toward hay and water, toward recovery, toward tomorrow. The choice landed like a door closing softly, final all the same. Elaine spoke into her radio, calling for fluids and a transport incubator that wasn't designed for something this small. "We'll monitor," she said, careful and formal. "Minimal intervention." Mateo's shoulders sagged, as if the phrase had weight. Thomas kept his face steady, but his hands curled into fists inside his jacket pockets, then forced themselves open again. Outside, the sun climbed higher, bright and indifferent. Inside, the calf's eyes opened for a moment, dark, glassy, searching, and locked on Thomas like it recognized him as the last fixed thing in the room. Thomas didn't step closer, not yet. He just rested a palm on the gate and whispered, almost soundless, "Hang on," letting the words settle like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. By late morning, the maternity barn felt too bright, like the sun was trying to pretend nothing was wrong. Thomas Walker washed his hands at the stainless sink, slow and thorough, the way he did after every birth. The water ran hot, but his fingers stayed cold, as if the chill had moved in under his skin. Outside the stall, the calf lay on layered blankets beneath a heat lamp, still so small it looked borrowed from another species. The lamp hummed, the monitor beeped, and the air carried that uneasy mix of milk powder and disinfectant. Thomas kept his gaze on the tiny ribs, counting the fluttering breaths without moving his lips. Dr. Elaine Brooks read the numbers like they were a verdict. "He's hypothermic," she said, voice calm in the way professionals learn to be calm. "And he's burning energy faster than we can give it." She didn't look at Thomas when she added, "We'll follow protocol. Comfort care. Observation." Thomas nodded because that was what a man with his reputation did. He was the keeper who didn't let feelings write policy, the one who'd stopped interns from doing reckless, well-meaning things. He'd watched too many animals suffer longer because humans couldn't accept loss. That was the rule. You don't turn a wild life into a human project. Mateo Ruiz hovered nearby, eyes red, trying to be useful without getting in the way. "If he makes it to sundown," he started, then swallowed the rest. Thomas heard the unspoken word, miracle, and felt it scrape against him. He laid a steady hand on Mateo's shoulder, not comforting, just anchoring. "We do what's right," he said, meaning the rule. Robert Mason, the preserve director, arrived with a tablet under one arm and the tight expression of a man who had budgets in his bloodstream. He listened, asked 2 questions, then looked from Elaine to Thomas. "We can't set a precedent," he said quietly. "If we intervene every time, we become a clinic, not a preserve." His tone carried sympathy, but it landed like a lock turning. Thomas kept his face unreadable, but the words stirred something bitter. He thought of poachers, highways, fences, human decisions that shaped nature more than any storm ever could. The preserve called itself wild, yet everything about it was managed. Still, the line had to be drawn somewhere, and he was the man everyone expected to draw it. They tried what the rule allowed. Elaine rubbed the calf's gums with glucose gel, adjusted the heat, added warmed fluids under the skin. Thomas held the towel while she worked, his hands steady the way they'd been for decades. The calf's trunk twitched once, then fell limp again. The monitor flashed a number that made Mateo inhale sharply. At noon, Marisol finally ate, her trunk sweeping hay into her mouth with slow, tired grace. She didn't step toward the calf. She didn't call. She simply kept herself upright, focused on living. Thomas watched her and felt anger rise, at her, at instinct, at the unfair math of survival. Then the anger turned, and he hated himself for it. Elaine pulled Thomas aside near the feed room where the cameras didn't stare. "I know you care," she said, softer now. "But caring isn't the same as saving. If his lungs fill, if he aspirates, it won't be peaceful." She held his gaze until he looked away, as if she could see the place in him that wanted to break. In the afternoon, a thin wind rattled the barn's tin roof. The calf's temperature dipped again despite the lamp, despite the blankets, despite all the careful hands. Thomas leaned in close enough to feel the faint warmth leaving. The calf's eye opened, just a slit, and for a second it looked straight through him, like it was searching for someone who could rewrite the ending. Matteo whispered, "Please," to nobody in particular. Robert checked his watch. Elaine tightened her jaw. Thomas stood there with the weight of all his own advice pressing down on him. He heard his old words in his head. Don't interfere, don't attach, don't turn grief into action, and for the first time in years, they sounded like something said by a man who hadn't been tested. When the calf's breathing stuttered, Thomas reacted without thinking, rubbing the tiny chest in slow circles the way a mother elephant would. The movement was simple, almost tender, and it shocked Matteo more than the alarms did. Thomas stopped, as if caught breaking a law. The room held its silence, waiting to see what kind of man he would be next. He stepped back, forced himself to breathe, and watched Elaine reset the heat once more. "We'll reassess at dusk," she said, professional again, sealing the moment behind procedure. Thomas nodded, but his eyes stayed on the calf's shaking flank. Outside, the sun began its long slide toward evening, and the barn filled with a quiet that felt like a countdown. Evening settled over Red Rock like a slow, bruised shadow, cooling the sand and pulling warmth out of the air. Thomas Walker returned to the maternity barn with a fresh thermos of coffee he didn't want and a clipboard he barely looked at. The preserve quieted at dusk, but the silence inside that stall felt different. Tight. Watchful. Like a room waiting for bad news. The calf lay where it had all day, smaller now in Thomas's eyes, as if hope itself had been shrinking. The heat lamp threw a weak circle of light over wrinkled gray skin and a rib cage that fluttered instead of rising. Each breath came late, as if the body had to be convinced to keep going. Thomas found himself listening for the gap between breaths more than the breaths themselves. Elaine checked the monitor and didn't hide her face this time. "He's tiring," she said, and the words carried the soft finality of a door closing. Matteo stood behind her, fists clenched, his gaze fixed on the calf's trunk like he could will it to move. Robert Mason stayed near the entrance, arms crossed, as if distance could keep him clean. Marisol shifted in the straw, her eyes half-lidded, her body still heavy from labor. She took one step toward the calf, then stopped. Her trunk hovered, uncertain, and then lowered to the ground to pull hay closer to herself. It wasn't cruelty. It was biology doing math. Thomas felt something cold settle behind his sternum, a grief with no place to go. Matteo whispered, "She's not even trying." Thomas didn't correct him, because part of him wanted to agree. Another part remembered mothers who had rejected calves for reasons humans couldn't understand. Illness, weakness, danger. He'd preached that animals weren't villains, just survivors. Tonight the lesson felt thin, like paper in rain. When the calf made a faint sound, more a breathy click than a cry, Marisol flinched. The noise was so small it barely belonged to the world, yet it seemed to pull every eye in the barn toward it. Thomas crouched, close enough to see the calf's lashes tremble. The eye opened wider than before, glossy and dark, and for a moment it held him like a question. Elaine prepared a bottle with warmed formula, the smell sweet and wrong in the stall. She tried to place the nipple at the calf's mouth, but the calf couldn't latch. Its tongue barely moved. The head sagged back onto the blanket, defeated by its own weight. Elaine exhaled once, controlled and quiet. "He's not strong enough," she said, and stepped away. Robert cleared his throat as if he needed permission to be human. "We've done what we can," he murmured. "If we push harder, we risk suffering." His eyes flicked to Thomas, the keeper who had taught everyone how to let go. Thomas felt the expectation in that glance. Be the example. Be the rule. He nodded, because his body knew the motion, even as his heart fought it. Then the monitor chirped with a sharp, impatient warning. Oxygen dropping. Heart rate unstable. Matteo lurched forward and Elaine caught his arm. "No," she said, firm. "We don't panic. We don't make it worse." Matteo's face crumpled anyway. Thomas watched the calf's chest flutter, pause, flutter again, and something in him snapped, not loudly, but cleanly, like a thread pulled too hard. He reached through the gate and rubbed the calf's side again, slow and steady, warming skin with his palm. It was an instinct he'd always resisted, because it felt like a promise. The calf's trunk twitched, then fell. Thomas kept rubbing, not praying, not bargaining, just refusing to stand still. Elaine didn't stop him this time. She only watched, her jaw tight, eyes shining with a frustration she rarely let show. Marisol rose, heavy and unsteady, and approached the calf with cautious steps. For one breathless second, Thomas thought she might change her mind. Her trunk touched the calf's head, lingered, then pushed gently. Not to lift, but to move it away, as if clearing space. The gesture was quiet, decisive. The barn seemed to inhale and then forget how to exhale. Matteo turned his face away, shoulders shaking. Robert looked down at his shoes. Elaine stared at the numbers, blinking hard. Thomas stayed crouched, hand still on the calf, feeling how little warmth there was to hold. He whispered, barely audible, "Not like this." And he didn't know if he meant the calf's end or his own obedience. As the last light drained from the barn windows, Thomas stood and walked out into the cooling air. He told himself he was going to file notes, to follow procedure, to do what he'd always done. But his feet didn't carry him toward the office. They carried him toward the old service road behind the barns, where no one would see his face, and where the night, wide, empty, and honest, couldn't pretend this was easy. Night wrapped the preserve in a thin, restless quiet. The desert cooled fast, pulling heat from the ground as if reclaiming it. Thomas Walker walked the service road alone, boots crunching on gravel, hands deep in his jacket pockets. He told himself the calf was no longer his concern. He told himself rules existed to spare men from carrying grief home. The old maintenance shed stood dark at the edge of the property, its corrugated walls ticking as metal contracted. Thomas leaned against it and closed his eyes. In the distance, coyotes called, their voices sharp and alive. He had always admired that sound. Tonight it felt like mockery. Survival was loud out here. Dying, somehow, was quieter. His phone vibrated in his pocket, surprising him. He almost ignored it, then saw the name he hadn't saved, but never forgot. His son. The call had come too late once before, years ago, from a hospital hallway that smelled of bleach and fear. Thomas hesitated, then let it ring out, the silence afterward heavier than the buzz. He remembered a different night, a different building, holding a paper cup of cold coffee while doctors spoke in careful sentences. A premature birth. Complications. Words stacked like stones. He remembered choosing to step back, Trusting professionals, trusting odds. He remembered driving home alone, convincing himself that acceptance was strength. Thomas opened his eyes and stared into the dark. He had built his life around that belief. That restraint was wisdom. That intervention was arrogance. It had kept him respected, promoted, reliable. It had also left certain rooms in his memory permanently unfinished. Tonight, those rooms felt crowded. When he returned to the barn, the lights were dimmed for evening checks. Elaine stood by the stall, shoulders slumped in a way Thomas had never seen. "He's still hanging on," she said quietly. "Not hope, not resignation, just fact." The calf lay motionless except for the faintest tremor at the flank. Mateo sat on an overturned bucket nearby, eyes hollow with exhaustion. "He keeps looking toward the gate," the young man said. "Like he's waiting." Thomas didn't ask for who. He stepped closer and crouched, careful not to crowd the space. The calf's eye opened a fraction, unfocused, then drifted shut again. Elaine watched Thomas closely now. "We're past protocol," she said. "Anything more is personal." It wasn't a warning. It was an acknowledgement. Thomas felt the word land where it hurt most. Personal meant responsibility without cover. It meant owning outcomes instead of sharing them with policy. Robert Mason appeared at the doorway, drawn by the quiet. He took in the scene inside. "Tom," he said, using the name he rarely used. "You know where this ends." Thomas met his gaze and saw not authority, but fatigue. The preserve ran on compromises. This one felt sharper than most. Thomas rested his palm against the warm edge of the gate. "I know where it usually ends," he replied. His voice surprised him. Steady, low, certain in a way he hadn't felt all day. "But I also know we're not innocent observers anymore. We built this place. We moved her. We changed the ground." The monitor chirped again, softer this time, like a plea running out of breath. Thomas didn't look away. He thought of the phone still in his pocket, the call he hadn't taken. He thought of promises made to no one and everyone. The line he'd guarded for decades blurred, then disappeared. "I'll take responsibility," Thomas said, and the words seemed to rearrange the air. Elaine inhaled sharply. Mateo looked up, hope flaring and scaring him at the same time. Robert stared, searching Thomas's face for doubt. He didn't find it. Elaine stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If you do this," she said, "there's no manual." Thomas nodded. "There never is," he answered. He opened the gate and reached for a fresh blanket, his hands no longer trembling. Outside, the desert night listened, wide and indifferent, as a keeper who had never broken rules prepared to cross a line he could no longer see. The decision moved faster than Thomas expected. As if once spoken, it demanded motion. He wrapped the calf in warmed blankets, careful with the neck, mindful of the fragile rhythm under his palm. Elaine steadied the tiny head while Mateo fetched the portable heater, his hands shaking with purpose instead of fear. The barn felt suddenly too small. Thomas signed the incident log with his own name and no qualifiers, the pen scratching louder than it should have. He didn't ask Robert for permission. He didn't look at the cameras. He folded the paper, slid it into his jacket, and felt the weight of it settle there like a stone. Responsibility had a temperature. Tonight it burned. Outside, the night bit hard. The desert had shed its heat, and stars crowded the sky with indifferent brilliance. Thomas carried the calf against his chest, shielding it from the wind with his coat. The body was alarmingly light, a life that seemed borrowed. He matched his steps to the faint breathing, counting, steadying, refusing to hurry. They loaded into the utility truck parked behind the service shed, the one without logos or trackers. Elaine adjusted the heater and checked the calf's gums, murmuring numbers like a lullaby. Mateo climbed in beside Thomas, eyes wide, loyal to the moment. No one spoke as the engine turned over and the gate rolled open. The drive took them along the back road skirting the preserve, past fencing Thomas had helped install years ago. Headlights cut tunnels through scrub and shadow. Every bump felt dangerous. Thomas drove with the careful patience he'd learned hauling injured animals. Slow, smooth, apologetic to the road. He whispered once, "Easy," and meant it for all of them. They reached the old garage behind Thomas's house, a converted space he'd used for equipment repairs and winter prep. He had cleared it earlier without knowing why. Now it welcomed them with concrete floors and a single workbench. They set the heater, layered blankets, and dimmed the lights until the room felt less like a shop and more like a nest. Elaine moved with a surgeon's calm, but her voice carried urgency. "Tube feeding," she said. "He can't suck." Thomas nodded and fetched the kit he'd kept for emergencies he'd never wanted to imagine. His hands, steady with rope and steel, hesitated over the thin tube. The margin for error felt like a breath. He guided the tube with painstaking care, counting inches, listening for resistance that would mean lungs instead of stomach. The calf twitched, then settled. When the warm formula flowed, Thomas watched for coughing, for panic. None came. The chest fluttered, then steadied. It wasn't recovery. It was permission to continue. Minutes stretched. The heater hummed. The only sound was the clock on the wall marking time with a patience Thomas didn't trust. Elaine checked vitals and exhaled. "He tolerated it," she said. Mateo pressed a hand to his mouth, eyes shining. Thomas felt the room tilt, not with joy, but with the fragile relief of a bridge holding. They set alarms for 60 minutes, then 90, then 60 again. No one sat, no one rested. Thomas rubbed the calf's side between feedings, slow circles that carried warmth where machines couldn't. He spoke quietly. Not promises, just presence. The calf's trunk curled once, a small accidental hook that caught Thomas's finger. Near dawn, exhaustion pressed in, heavy and insistent. Elaine leaned against the workbench, eyes closed, still counting in her head. Mateo brewed coffee. No one drank. Thomas stood over the calf and felt something loosen in his chest. Not victory, not hope, but commitment. Whatever came next would be faced awake. As the first gray light crept under the garage door, the calf breathed on its own for a full minute, without faltering. Thomas didn't smile. He didn't dare. He only adjusted the blanket and set the next alarm, understanding at last what he had done. He hadn't saved a life. He had agreed to stand with it, for as long as it asked. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale wash of light slipping through the garage windows. Thomas Walker stood exactly where he had been for hours, spine stiff, eyes fixed on the rise and fall of the calf's chest. The desert outside warmed quickly, but inside the air stayed cool and deliberate, shaped by alarms, heaters, and the quiet discipline of not hoping too much. The first feeding after sunrise went slower. The calf's mouth resisted the tube, a small protest that felt enormous. Thomas waited, patient, letting the body decide the pace. Elaine adjusted the angle, whispering instructions that sounded more like encouragement than medicine. When the formula finally flowed without distress, all three of them exhaled at once. By mid-morning, the preserve called. Robert's name lit the phone screen, and Thomas let it ring. He knew what the call would bring. Questions, procedures, consequences. Right now, the only number that mattered was the one on the monitor, flickering between danger and possibility. Thomas turned the phone face down and returned his hand to the calf's side. Mateo noticed first. "He's warmer," he said, barely daring to believe it. Elaine checked the thermometer twice, then again. The number had climbed, not enough to celebrate, but enough to matter. "He's responding," she said, careful with the word. Responding meant the body was listening. It didn't mean it would agree. The hours stacked into a fragile routine. Feed, Weight? Check. Rub warmth into skin that still felt too thin for the world. Thomas moved without thinking now, guided by alarms and instinct braided together. Each time the calf swallowed, it felt like a decision renewed. Each time it rested, Thomas feared the rest would be final. Around noon, the calf opened its eyes longer than before, not searching this time, observing. The gaze drifted across the room, landed on Thomas's face, and stayed there. It wasn't recognition. Not yet. It was awareness. Thomas leaned closer without touching, as if sound alone might break the spell. "That's it," he murmured, low and steady. "Just stay." Elaine stepped outside to make calls she'd been avoiding, her voice muffled through the door. Mateo sank onto a crate, exhaustion finally catching him, his knee bouncing in a rhythm that matched the clock. Thomas stayed standing, anchored by the small, stubborn presence on the blankets. The calf's trunk lifted a fraction, then fell, effort spent. In the afternoon, the phone rang again. This time, Thomas answered. Robert's voice was tight, controlled. "We know," he said. No accusation, no approval, just fact. "We'll talk later," Thomas agreed and ended the call before it could become more. He felt lighter afterward, as if the secret had been costing oxygen. The calf's breathing steadied into a pattern Thomas could almost trust. Almost. Elaine returned with supplies and a look that mixed worry and resolve. "If he makes it through tonight," she said, "we'll have options." Options. The word carried a dangerous sweetness. Thomas nodded, filing it away where it couldn't distract him. As dusk approached, the calf accepted a bottle for the first time, lips clumsy but determined. The formula dribbled, the swallow uneven, yet it worked. Mateo laughed once, a short, broken sound, then covered his face. Thomas didn't laugh. He felt something heavier and better settle in, responsibility deepening into care. When the sun dropped and the garage filled with long shadows, Thomas reset the alarms and dimmed the lights. The calf slept, breathing slow and real. Thomas finally sat, back against the wall, eyes never leaving that small, rising chest. The night ahead was still long, but for the first time, it felt like time they might actually get through together. The knock came just after sunrise, sharp and official, cutting through the soft, mechanical hum of heaters. Thomas Walker knew the sound before he reached the door. It carried weight, clipboards, statutes, consequences. He took one last look at the calf, breathing steady in sleep, then opened the door to faces trained to measure risk. 2 federal inspectors stood in the driveway, wind tugging at their jackets. One introduced herself, calm and precise. The other scanned the space like a ledger. "We've received a report," she said, eyes flicking past Thomas toward the garage. Thomas didn't argue. He stepped aside. Truth, he'd learned, worked best when it wasn't cornered. Inside, the inspectors moved carefully, documenting temperatures, equipment, the feeding log Thomas had kept by hand. Elaine arrived moments later, her presence firming the room. Mateo hovered near the wall, silent. The calf slept through it all, unaware that the air had changed, that decisions were being weighed above him like clouds. "This was unauthorized," the inspector said, not unkindly. "You understand the implications." Thomas nodded. He understood fines, suspension, worse. He also understood the cost of turning back now. He spoke evenly, choosing words like stones across water. "If there's fault," he said, "it's mine. I won't pass it down." The calf stirred as if listening, trunk lifting an inch before settling again. The inspector watched the movement, then checked the monitor. "He's improving," she noted, surprise slipping through her professional tone. Elaine seized the opening, explaining the feeding tolerance, the temperature trend, the first bottle. Facts, not pleas. Robert Mason arrived mid-sentence, breathless and pale. He listened, then surprised everyone by saying nothing at first. He studied Thomas's notes, the times written in careful ink. "He documented everything," Robert said finally. "He didn't hide risk. He carried it." The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that tests resolve. The lead inspector folded her arms. "This can't become policy," she said. Thomas agreed without hesitation. "It shouldn't," he replied. "This was singular. So was the choice." The words hung there, not defiant, just true. The calf breathed, the heater hummed, the clock kept time for no one. They stepped outside to talk. Thomas waited by the garage door, hands open, prepared for whatever followed. Elaine stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. No longer just a colleague. Matteo stared at the ground, counting cracks in the concrete. The desert sun climbed, indifferent to the verdict forming in the shade. When the inspectors returned, the decision came softly. Temporary allowance, continued monitoring, immediate oversight, consequences deferred, not erased. "If he declines," the inspector said, "we reassess." Thomas nodded. He could live with reassessment. He had learned how to live with worse. Relief moved through the room like a careful exhale. Matteo laughed, then caught himself. Elaine closed her eyes for a beat too long. Thomas didn't celebrate. He returned to the calf and rested a hand near the small shoulder, close enough to warm, far enough to respect the line he'd crossed. That afternoon, the calf stood for 3 seconds. 3 unsteady seconds that changed the air again. Thomas counted them without smiling, marking them as proof, not promise. When the calf sat back down, breathing hard but proud, Thomas felt the weight of what remained. Not triumph, but stewardship. As evening settled, Thomas updated the log, every detail precise. He knew the story would spread, that opinions would harden. He also knew the truth had already chosen him. Saving a life had a price. Tonight, the bill was patience, vigilance, and the courage to keep standing when the room went quiet again. Months later, the desert wore spring like a careful promise. Thomas Walker watched from the observation fence as Miles, named quietly, without ceremony, stood among older elephants, smaller but steady. The calf's steps were still cautious, but they carried intention now. Thomas kept his distance, learning the new discipline of being present without being central. A gray matriarch named Lila lingered nearby, her movements deliberate, eyes old and patient. She had lost calves before the preserve ever bore its name. When Miles drifted too close, she did not push him away. She shifted, made room, let her shadow cover him. Thomas felt the knot in his chest loosen at the sight. The work had changed him. He no longer rushed toward alarms or lingered at gates. He trusted others to do what he once did alone. Elaine led the care team now, calm and exacting, her voice steady in meetings that once left Thomas silent. Matteo had grown too, less frantic, more sure, learning that care could be fierce without being reckless. There were days Miles stumbled, days he refused food, days the weather turned sharp and memories returned. On those days, Thomas stayed back, hands clasped behind him, honoring the line he'd crossed and then redrawn. The calf learned from elephants, not from men. That was the point. That was the gift. When the inspectors returned, they came as observers, not judges. Clipboard stayed closed more often than not. They watched Miles lean into Lila's side, watched the herd close ranks against wind. "This," one of them said softly, "is what success looks like." Thomas nodded, grateful for the word and wary of it all the same. On a cool morning, Miles lifted his trunk and answered the herd's call with a sound that was still thin, but unmistakably his. The reply came back, low, layered, accepting. Thomas felt tears gather and did not wipe them away. He let them be part of the day, part of the cost he had agreed to pay. Time passed the way it always does, quietly insisting. Thomas filed his last report and handed in his keys without speeches. Retirement fit him better than he expected. He tended a small garden, fixed fences for neighbors, learned how to sleep through the night. Some mornings he still woke early, listening for alarms that never came. He returned once more to the fence at dusk, when the light turned the sand the color of old copper. Miles recognized him, not as a keeper, not as a savior, but as a familiar shape in a familiar place. The trunk reached gentle, a brush of air against Thomas's sleeve. No cameras, no witnesses, just acknowledgement. Thomas didn't touch back. He smiled, small and sure, and stepped away. He had learned what saving a life required, and what it didn't. It didn't require possession. It didn't require applause. It required knowing when to stand close and when to make space. As the herd moved on, Thomas watched until dust softened their outlines. The desert held its quiet again, wide and honest. He felt peace settle. Not the kind that forgets, but the kind that remembers and still breathes. Sometimes, he thought, the unthinkable is simply choosing hope and letting it walk on without you. The sun slipped below the ridge, and the preserve breathed out. Thomas turned for home, carrying nothing with him that didn't belong. Somewhere behind him, Miles stepped into the rhythm of the herd, smaller, resilient, alive. The circle closed without a sound, and that, Thomas knew, was enough. If this story moved you, even just a little, I'd love to hear from you. You don't need to write a long comment. Just type 1 if you believe every life deserves a chance. Your comment helps this story reach others who may need it today, and it lets me know you're here, listening, and still care about stories like this. If you'd like to continue this journey with me, through more true, meaningful stories of courage, compassion, and unexpected hope, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, and I'd be honored to share the next one with you. Thank you for being here.